that at this point. I wouldn't mind if they created a good system and then kept it. But when they make a system that works and you learn how to use it and then they change it for no benefit to the user, and I can't even see what benefit it would bring them, well, that's just frustrating. I wish this was part of a Purim spiel, but unfortunately, no. It's just incompetence. All right, so that gets there. And now I can share my screen if it allows me to find the correct tab again. And it looks like it did. Okay. All right. Okay. Just give me a second. It was meant to be such a fun opening with being a little bit in costume in honor of Purim around the corner and of talking about the joy of the holiday and of the masking, because we're going to be talking a little bit about the appearance of a mask, at least that's one way to translate it, in our Torah portion today, and what purpose it might have served. And along the way, we might also talk a little bit about masking as part of the Purim custom. But now that we've already burnt through a few minutes, we're going to have to dive right in and see what we've got, and we'll pick it up as we go. We are in chapter 34, verse 27. For those of you that have not read the entire parasha or kept up to date, this is after the golden calf incident. This is Moses back up on the mountain with the second tablets that are being inscribed after he shattered the first ones. So let's see what happens near the end of his stay on the mountain. Adonai said to Moshe, "Write you down these words, for in accordance with these words, I cut with you a covenant and with Israel." To cut a covenant is the idiomatic usage of making that agreement in biblical Hebrew. And Fox, as is typical for his translation, likes to keep an awkward word phrase if it highlights something that maybe is a little different than English. Now, he, meaning Moshe, was there beside Adonai for 40 days and 40 nights. Bread he did not eat, and water he did not drink. But he wrote down on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 words, the Aseret HaDevarim or Aseret HaDibrot, two different ways that we refer to that in contemporary language, also known as the 10 Commandments for others. Now it was, when Moshe came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony in Moshe's hand, when he came down from the mountain, now Moshe did not know that the skin of his face was radiating because of having spoken with him, meaning having spoken with God. So we've talked about one aspect of this verse before with the idea that there were horns of light, with the phrase karan here, sometimes being misunderstood as actual physical horns as opposed to beams or rays of light. Turns out that root words can have multiple meanings depending upon context. Unfortunately, that did not prevent Michelangelo from putting horns on his statue of Moses, but we've covered that in other classes. But he is shining. That is the upshot of all of this. Aharon and all the children of Israel saw Moshe, and here the skin of his face was radiating, so they were afraid to approach him. Moshe called to them, and then Aharon and all those exalted in the community came back to him, and Moshe spoke to them. So they're clearly off-putting, terrifying. This is a similar reaction that they had when God first spoke the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, with the people recoiling, retreating because of the intensity of the experience. That seems to be replicated in some measure at this point. But Moses brings them back. And then we get into our, resolution of this issue. Afterward, all the children of Israel approached, and he commanded them, all that Adonai had spoken with him on Mount Sinai. This is sort of the official delivery of God's message. Now, when Moshe had finished speaking with them, he put a veil upon his face. So this masveh is our word for a veil. It is very similar to masechot, the word that gets used for masks in the Purim. And the commentators all agree that this was some form of face covering. Veil works in English, although in English, veil often has a translucent interpretation. There's no indication that this was like a wedding veil, that this could have been a completely opaque veil. We don't know exactly, but this is apparently masking Moses's face in some way. And whenever Moshe would come before the presence of Adonai to speak with him, he would remove the veil until he had gone out. And whenever he would come out and speak to the children of Israel that which he had been commanded, the children of Israel would see Moshe's face, that the skin of Moshe's face was radiating. But then Moshe would put the veil, the covering, back on his face until he came in to speak with him, meaning with God again. So the basic interpretation of this or explanation of this is that Moses now has a special piece of wardrobe that is different than everything else that we've heard. We had an extensive discussion of the wardrobe of the Kohanim, the priests. They didn't have anything like this, but Moshe does. And there is a on and off setting. And it apparently is off, meaning his face is unobscured when he is speaking to God and when he is speaking to the nation in his official capacity. And it is on, that is to say, his face is covered, when he is not doing one of those two things. And that's going to be our question. Why is he wearing this mask? On the one hand, it could be because the people were afraid of him, as we saw earlier in the verses that we just went over. But if that was the motivation, then why ever take it off ever again? It could be that he was wearing it as some form of humility, but again, we have to reconcile the on and off again. So our commentators are going to lead us into this discussion of what was he exactly masking and why was he exposing his face at the times that he did. But before we dive in, as always, we'll do a short pause. If anyone has a question or a comment, you can feel free to put it into the chat, either YouTube or Zoom, or you can just go ahead and fire it away if you're on Zoom, unmute, and share with us your ideas. I know everybody's far too timid to do so, and I don't see any indications, so we're going to jump right into our commentary. So we're going to begin with Rashi. Not surprising, he gives us some of the more common comments, and then we'll build off of his interpretation. Masveh, that is our word that's being translated as veil, is an Aramaic expression. So right off the bat, whenever you get a Rashi where he is talking about the language, the derivation, the meaning of the word, that should be an indication that this is not a word that is universally understood. Come across the word shemesh or mayim, Rashi doesn't bother explaining those words to us because those are just standard words. But masveh does not appear elsewhere in the Torah, and thus it requires additional explanation. And it doesn't have a whole lot of detail where it does show up, which means that explanation is going to leave us scratching our head if we don't work a little harder at it. So he says this is Aramaic. What is his basis for that? Well, it occurs in the Talmud. Her heart perceived, and there we see the same root word. Here too, masved denotes a cloth that was put in front of the face and the region of the eyes. So rather than a veil like the style that you might see in a depiction of a harem sort of costume where the eyes were visible but the rest was covered, this would be more like a cloth hanging over the entirety of the face. And out of reverence for the rays of glory, those horns of light, that not everyone should feast himself on them. Now we have a motivation, that this is not about the fear of the people, but this is about reserving the exposure for that glory for only certain times. Moses used to put the veil in front of them, meaning his eyes, that's the focal point of this light, but took it off during the time when he spoke to Israel and during the time when the omnipresent, God, conversed with him, until the moment when he was going out. And also, when he went out without the veil. Wait, hold on, wait. I almost had it, right? So Moses has this veil on, And he takes it off whenever he is speaking to Israel, and of course, when he is speaking with God. However, what is this last part? When he went out without the veil? Well, that is still a little ambiguous. Were there times when he would go about without the veil at all? Was the light constant, is the underlying question. Was this just used for blocking the rays, and when the rays weren't there, then there was no need for the veil, and when the rays were there, then you needed to wear a veil, except when actually talking with God or the nation? That seems to be the position that we're at. But that still feels a little unclear, because how often were the rays around? Were they showing up a lot? Were they only for a single occurrence? Were they something that was 24/7? That's something that our other commentators are going to dig in for us. So let's see more about these rays, beginning with Ibn Ezra, who also did his language discussion, but I cut that out for our purposes of time. Some say that the light was renewed upon Moses's face every time Moses came to the tent of meeting and spoke with God. All right, so there are some opinions, which Ibn Ezra is quoting here, that says indeed that the light was a come and go kind of thing. It was not permanent. He would go in and talk with God, the light would be renewed, and then when Moses left the tent, the light remained as long as he related God's words to the children of Israel. When Moses finished speaking, he put on the veil, for he knew that the light would depart and his face would return to its prior state. It would be an insult then if the Israelites saw his face without light radiating from it. All right, so the first opinion that Ibn Ezra is quoting is saying that, as a matter of fact, most of the time, his face was not illuminated. His face was only illuminated during that immediate period when he was in conversation with God and then relaying that information to the nation. And immediately after he relayed it, his face would dim, and that was precisely why he covered his face. It was not, as Rashi had hinted, or Rashi had stated quite clearly, that it was there to keep people from feasting upon the rays of glory at inappropriate times, but instead was precisely because it would be insulting if you saw Moses as the regular guy. It would be, well, to use a Wizard of Oz reference, looking at the man behind the curtain when you are supposed to only look at him as the great and mighty Oz. That Moses has to maintain his status as this elevated figure because he is conveying mitzvot, he is conveying the law, the Torah, as we now call it, and that required a gravitas of station that had to be preserved. And people would need to remember him first and last as the man whose face shone with the light of God. And if he just looked like a regular guy for most of the time, well, then, okay, fine, he lights up when he's doing this, and that's impressive and all, but it would also be kind of a big letdown in the respect for him whenever he wasn't shining. Now, that is not the only opinion. Surprise, surprise, in Jewish study. And Ibn Ezra brings Rabbi Sadia Gaon's opinion. Sadia Gaon says that the light was not removed from Moses' face until the day of his death, meaning that this was a 24/7 experience, that he was always shining. And Ibn Ezra agrees. This is correct, meaning he thinks that is the better opinion. However, Sadia says that Moses put on the veil so that the Israelites would not be afraid when they quarreled with each other. All right, so that may not be self-explanatory, but what Sadia Gaon is trying to say is that you have to put yourself in this as a real situation. Imagine you go to court and you are standing in front of the judge, and the judge is literally glowing with God's light. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's kind of reassuring. I know that this is somebody that is the elect of God in a way that no one else is. So that's great. Because I'm going to trust that person more than I would trust somebody who wasn't shining with God's light. On the other hand, we've already seen in this chapter and in other instances that the average person is terrified of God's light, that this is not something that most of us can stand in the presence of, and feel enough at ease to be able to freely state the facts of the case from our point of view, and that this would have perverted justice because the people standing in front of Moses during a quarrel, during a court case, would not have been able to actually speak their case in a way that would allow truth to be discovered. So Saadia Gaon is worried. It says that the veil was there as a precaution against miscarriages of justice that would come because of people's emotional response to witnessing Moses's face. We're still going to have to work out why he took it off at other times, but Ibn Ezra doesn't give us that explanation at this point in Saadia's opinion. However, he does disagree with Saadia about the opinion. He doesn't believe that it should be about whether or not there was miscarriages of justice. Instead, says Ibn Ezra, I believe that Moses put on a veil out of respect to the light which God newly created upon his face. This wasn't about respecting litigants. This was about the respect of that light. He didn't want Israel to constantly see it. He wanted them to see it only when he spoke God's words. He removed the veil when he came into the tent of meeting to speak with God face to face. This is the meaning of, but when Moses went in, from our verse 34. Okay, so Ibn Ezra echoes the feeling of Rashi, even if he disagrees about maybe some of the other details, that the veil was there to keep the exposure from being something that people would constantly see, that it was keeping that light away from the nation, except for very special moments. And he doesn't quite go into the reason why. We'll see a couple opinions about why that might be. But for the moment, that seems to be his take on it. All right. Now, we're going to do a complete jump to a different explanation of why Moses would have this veil, which is just a great example of how there is a diverse set of opinions within the Jewish studies. So Kli Yakar gives his opinion for the covering. He placed a cover over his face. Why? Moshe, in his great humility, was embarrassed when people gaped at the radiance of his face. But when he received instruction from God, he was required to remove it, in keeping with the sage's principle that one who is prone to shame cannot learn, taken from Pirkei Avot, which if you haven't studied, get on it. It's an incredible section of Mishnah. All right, so let's deconstruct what he's saying about the veil in general. So this covering was because of Moses's choice, not about the light, not about the litigants, but about his own humility. He was conscious, self-conscious, that as he walked around, people would look at him and go, he's glowing. And they were stunned. I mean, we already saw them being afraid when he came down off the mountain. And despite what Ibn Ezra seems to be having as an idea that there's a problem with the constant exposure, Kli Yakar is saying that constant exposure would not make it any bit less amazing for the average person. And Moses was simply uncomfortable with that kind of attention. However, he had to take it off at other times. Why? Because you can't learn if you're embarrassed. It's a beautiful teaching in Pirkei Avot, and one that Kli Yakar is reinforcing here, which is that you have to be prepared to be uncomfortable if you're going to learn. You have to be prepared to be wrong. You have to be prepared to be corrected. You have to be prepared to ask a question, which by definition implies you don't know the answer. So you are admitting your ignorance about one issue or another. And that wasn't the kind of humility that Moses was displaying here, but it is what Kli Yakar wants to remind us. But it is also implying that if you are overly humble about people's reaction to you, even when you are doing something good, or perhaps especially because you're doing something good, that is still a form of self-censorship that is limiting your capacity to continue to grow and learn. So it is important when you are in the midst of actual learning to set aside that level of humility or of embarrassment and just be as shining as you need to be. And yes, you can be a little more humble when you're outside of that setting and go back to being a little bit more self-effacing, if you will. But in the midst of study, you put your hand up. In the midst of study, You ask questions, you make a suggestion, you argue your point of view, and it turns out you're wrong. That's okay. You're better off, and we're all better off for having people engage fully during those moments. All right. Now, Cheskuni, we're going to flip all the way around for a different explanation. When the Torah wrote Moses put the veil back on his face, he did so in order that the people did not have to look at how his face emitted the rays of light, as it would lose its character of being something holy. So Cheskuni is giving us an idea that perhaps most of us understand intuitively, but is being made explicit here, which is that familiarity breeds contempt. That if we are constantly being bathed in the glowing face of Moses, far from ever increasing our respect and appreciation of him, it would actually diminish our ability to appreciate it as something of sacred significance. It would just be, oh yeah, his face does that. We would lose that connection. So the veil going on and off was precisely in order that it would still be able to have a impact on people when they were seeing the glow. And it had to be hidden in order for the revelation to still have that impact and that significance, that people would still treat it as a holy occurrence when they were experiencing. All right. Questions or comments up to this point? Okay. Now, Kuzguni goes on to go back, not goes on, excuse me, goes back in Exodus 24 on the same theme in a little bit more detail. So he did not raise his hand. And so this is dealing with, in Exodus 24, a rather unusual passage where the elders of the people are having a feast beneath the image of God's throne. And it's a little striking. It's presented almost as blasé, but what's going on here? Why is this being allowed? Why is it reacting in this way? Well, Hizkuni has his own opinion. God had reason to punish the people who had been granted this vision because they carried on as if this was nothing extraordinary by eating and drinking. So he's saying, look, when it said God did not raise his hand, meaning like to strike or punish or admonish, that means that God could have or would have at least have had grounds to do so. Why? Because here they are having the most amazing vision that a person could possibly hope to have, and they're just treating it as though it was part of the regular world, and hey, we celebrate by eating and drinking. Now, that's fine for the holiday of Purim, starting tomorrow night, but that's not exactly the appropriate response for dealing with the revelation of the divine in this intimate of way. So, according to this interpretation, at this time, immediately before the giving of the Torah, God did not wish to spoil the joyous mood of the people, meaning so God let it slide because, we didn't want to ruin the moment. An alternate approach to these lines, all the Torah tells us that in spite of having been granted such visions, and one could have expected that this would have made them temporarily like angels, like Moses on Mount Sinai, who went 40 days and nights without food or drink, these nobles of the people had not attained that level of prophecy. They could continue to eat and drink without thereby harming themselves. So for them, they don't overestimate the vision they were having. These were not true prophets. They definitely were not at the level of Moses. And in fact, many other later commentators will point out that the very fact that they saw more physical representation implies that they were less close to what God is. That the more physical we are, the more we are drawn to a physical manifestation in our imagination of God, the further we are from the truth of God's non-physical existence in a way that transcends easy human understanding. All right. Back into our veil question, though. While he was still speaking to them, he did not wear the cloth. That's our question, right? We go back and forth on, okay, we get maybe why he was wearing the cloth and maybe how often the light was shining. We've got some pretty solid understanding of that. But why did he take it off sometimes? Well, this corresponds to Isaiah 30:20. Your eyes should look at your teachers. meaning that in the verse in Isaiah where we're being told you're supposed to be looking at your teachers. Well, as our sages explained in the Talmud, if I, this is Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi talking, had looked at his, that's Rabbi Meir's face, instead of merely at his back, I would have been even more learned. And that's saying something because Yehuda Hanassi was an incredible scholar. So what Yehuda Hanassi is saying, based off the passages in Isaiah, is that you are supposed to look at your teacher. You don't avert your eyes. You don't hide from them. You look at them. Well, this is probably partly just trying to tell us that you will learn more when you interact with a person face to face. One of the reasons why I do love in-person discussions and teaching. That's why I also like when people are able to have their cameras on for Zoom, because it allows me to see more of that facial body language of they're getting it or not getting it, what needs more explanation, what I can move through more quickly. But this also has to do with a sense of respect, that you learn best when you treat somebody with respect, but also treat them with the directness that is needed for truly being a student. That being a student doesn't mean you're just in their presence. Being a student doesn't mean you're just being obsequious with them. Being a student means that you thirst for their words and you look to them as powerfully as possible in order to learn from them every last thing you can possibly learn. And being too deferential will keep you from doing that. Going back to our earlier comment where Clea Carr reminded us that we have to be unashamed to truly learn. That while respecting our teachers, we also have to be unafraid to ask questions or challenge what we heard if it does not seem to fit other things that they have taught us, so that it can be untangled, and then we'll have a better idea. All right. Now, from the practical and the more direct understanding of the veil, we're now going to move into something a little bit more mystical, a little bit more of the ethereal, if you will. We're going to look at the Zohar. Now, as most people who follow me regularly know, I regularly don't go into the Zohar because the Zohar is incredibly difficult to understand. And it's incredibly difficult, even more difficult to teach than it is to understand, at least, and hope that it comes across correctly. That's why I always recommend that people are highly suspicious of those that make this their bread and butter, especially through digital mediums such as YouTube or TikTok, because trying to condense the Zohar into a short lesson really is hard. However, in this particular case, I found a passage that I feel is not only accessible, but also gives us an element to this interaction with Moses, the light, and his face that is meaningful and important for us to discuss. So going all the way back to Bereshit, the book of Genesis, we know that it says, "Let there be light." Well, this light is not just like the light that's hanging over my desk. This light was the original light, that there was a unique primordial created light that it transcends the normal light that we experience in our regular kind of days. This is the light of the eye. This is the true depth of light. Important to understand that the Zohar might be referring here to classical anatomy, with the idea that the light of the eye actually emitted rays. There's some element of that in a few of the different commentaries about the rays of light shining out from Moses. But what they are trying to say here is that this is the true light through which we get true perception. And we can leave out their understanding of the optics of it, but the mystical element of true perception, of true sight, is what is being emphasized here. This is the light that reveals all. It is the light which God showed to Adam through the first human, and through which he was able to see from one end of the world to the other. One of the classic midrashim, that the underlying essence of humanity is to apprehend, to comprehend, to pull into our mind a sharp and bright illuminated focus of all of creation. That's what humanity is meant to be. Now, we've messed up a lot and we don't see the world through that lens or with that brightness or intensity, but that is sort of the essence of what humanity should be striving for. Likewise, it was the light which God showed to David, who on seeing it burst forth into praise, saying, "Oh, how abundant is thy goodness, which thou hast laid upon them that fear thee," meaning that this is the light that shone through. And it is the light through which God showed to Moses the land of Israel, from Gilead to Dan. When Moses is nearing his death and he sees the extent of the land, we could ask, well, how can he see all of Israel? Because he is going to be standing only in one spot, a limited vantage point. And while it's true that from that spot you can see a real long chunk of the land of Israel, you're still not going to be able to see every valley. You're not going to see every hill on the side facing away from where you are. But if we see light here as more of a metaphor for deep understanding rather than just for light beams, then we can see that this light, this is the true light that is being used to show Moses truly the entirety of Israel rather than merely one panoramic photo. Okay. So with that idea of light now firmly in our mind, hopefully, when God foresaw that 3 sinful generations would arise, namely the generation of Enosh, the generation of the flood, and the generation of the Tower of Babel, the 3 generations in the Torah and Bereshit that go through all of that trouble, he put it away so that they should not enjoy it, and gave it to Moses for the first 3 months after he was born, when his mother hid him. Okay, a lot to unpack here. So those generations did not deserve, if you will, the light of creation. Yes, they could get light that just shone out of a star, but they were not going to get that true light of apprehension, of understanding, of deep exposure to the entirety of all that there was. Instead, they'd make do with the mundane light that, well, all of us have to deal with. However, Moses was given the gift of that light. He could see through the eyes, even as a child, through that light of ultimate creation. And of course, he was being hid because this was during the time of Pharaoh's decree. When he was brought before Pharaoh, meaning when he was then put in the reeds and brought into Pharaoh's household, God withdrew it from him and only restored it to him when he stood upon the mountain of Sinai to receive the Torah. So, yes, as this infant, there was this clear evidence of his greatness. Then it goes back because it was not appropriate in the halls of Pharaoh for that apprehension to exist. And then with Torah, it is fully restored, and now it shines. From that time, he had the use of it for the rest of his life, so that the Israelites could not approach him till he put a veil over his face. After that point, when we talk about the rays of light shining out from Moses' face, we're not just talking about a great makeup technique that gives him a glowing complexion. We are talking about his ability to see the world in this perfect understanding of all of its existence. And quite frankly, that would be terrifying, which is what we saw the people behave, which is how we saw the people behave when they first noticed him coming down off the mountain, that this was absolutely intimidating. And as such, the veil had to be put on front of his face. Now, this we can then use as well to understand why we have it exposed for some times and not for others, right? We have to make room for people to approach Moses because, like Sadia Gaon said, if they couldn't approach him openly, then we wouldn't be able to adjudicate anything. And we know from the book, from Parashat Yitro, that Moses as judge was very, very important. And we also know that people just had to talk to him about regular kinds of things. However, he did still need this perfect light. First, of course, to understand what God was telling him when he was in connection to God and learning from God. He had to be able to comprehend, to apprehend, to fully imbibe everything that God was giving him, which means he needed this perfect light of creation to reveal all of its details. But likewise, as the teacher, when he taught the people, he had to be able to see them in perfect clarity, in perfect definition, and the technical, modern tech word, that he had to be able to make sure that as teaching, that he missed none of them, so that each nuance that he was sharing would be understood by each of them, which, if you've ever done any teaching, you'll know is incredibly difficult. Sometimes you feel amazing if you're able to get one student to really understand something, even if you think that the rest, got it to 80%. And otherwise, sometimes you'll get all of them on board, but only for one part of the lesson and concept. It's very hard to ever feel like you are reaching all of them exactly to the maximum capacity that each of them have for that moment, for that lesson. And yet that is what Moses had to do, because he wasn't just sharing algebra or American history. He was sharing Torah. And Torah had to be both imbibed perfectly and transmitted perfectly. And the transmission, as we've talked about many, many times, is not just repeat after me, but the transmission has to be understand it this way, so that people would actually live according to Torah correctly, not merely be able to recite its words correctly. And for that, well, we needed to make sure that we had Moses with this perfect approach. All right. So in that, we can see that, well, we can ask our question, so which was the real Moses? Was Moses really Moses when the mask was off and the light was shining? Or was he at that point really just a mouthpiece for God? Was he really even him? And was he only himself when he put the mask on? It's an interesting flip for the way we normally look at the masks of Purim. In Purim, normally it is when you take off the mask that you reveal the truth, that Esther was Jewish, that Haman was evil, that Ahasuerus was kind of a fool, that it's the removal of the mask that exposes the trueness of a person. But for Moses, as a man, the real Moses probably did need to have times where he was not only the transmitter, where he was not only the voice of God for the people, that he was not only that teacher. And for that, he needed to put the veil on. Then people could approach, then he could have that more, human interaction that was essential for him as an individual. Okay, let's just finish up with another quote from Or HaChaim. It's a two-parter, and we'll see a little bit more about this masking. We need to understand why the Torah repeats something we have already been told in verse 30. That is to say, earlier in the verses, we got this whole idea of him coming down and the light and the fear and the veiling, and then we say it again in the very last verse. Why are we repeating? Remember, as a general rule, the Torah does not repeat itself unless there is a purpose to that second repetition. Perhaps the Torah wanted us to know that the Israelites needed to experience the fact that Moses' face emitted rays of light on more than one occasion in order that they should not interpret these rays as a residue of Moses' prolonged stay on the mountain of celestial surroundings. All right, I know that's a super long sentence, and that's part of the price we pay for reading classical text together. So what is Or HaChaim saying? He's saying, all right, let's imagine this. We're an Israelite, and Moses comes down off Mount Sinai, and his face is all shining. Okay, fine, but how long is that going to last? And even if it does last for a while, wouldn't we just think, oh, that's because he was up in heaven? That's because he was getting the Torah. That's because he was with God on the top of the holy mountain. Not anything intrinsic to Moses himself or Moses' relationship to God that persisted beyond that moment. And he goes on to argue, had they observed the phenomenon only once, the Israelites would have concluded that it would fade away with time, just as time made their own experience during the revelation fade away. So if the people had seen the glowing face, and then he had put the veil on and left it on, people would have assumed that the light they saw was just a one-time occurrence, and that it was just because he had been up on the mountain. And, the same way that having the light too much would diminish its impact on our own feeling of its holiness, as Chizkunim argued, so too having the light not be repeated would diminish our appreciation of what had taken place on Mount Sinai, that there needed to be some additional periodic reminders of the uniqueness of Moses, of the power of that revelation that was continuing throughout our time in the wilderness, and that the persistence of this was essential for sealing in us that this was more than just an amazing event, because that amazing singular event would have quickly faded from our own hearts and our own appreciation. So Or HaChaim is arguing here that this on again, off again with the mask was essential to maintain this ongoing and repeated exposure to the sanctity, the significance of this experience. And he also adds, it is also possible that the entire episode reflects a spiritual return by Moses to the time before man had sinned. And here we are getting a little hint back to the Zohar. So the idea being that when they see that light, they are also reminded of the primordial light, the original light, the light that existed in the world before we had messed up, and now we have to take the long way back. And that light is important because, as Or HaChaim continues in the second part of our comment, it is not forbidden to look at Moses's face, seeing that Moses did not object. There's no problem with Moses's face himself. Moreover, God himself wanted the people to get a glimpse of this light of life, this Or HaChaim, which, it's fun because that actually is the name of our commentator, the light which represented the idea of life at its best. And yes, sometimes we get a feeling of why a commentator chose a name for their book. And what he is saying here is that this is the ultimate goal, to be able to perceive the world with this light of life, this instruction of Torah, this vision of what is right and best in life, not the usual nonsense that we clutter our view with. That is something that we were given a taste of by seeing it reflected through Moses's own face, through the way he looked at the world. Each of us still have to struggle to try and capture that for ourselves, but it is important that we know it's there. It's important that we know that that is our goal, that there are different ways to look at this world, to shine out a light upon the world that will see it in its truth and see that in its ultimate beauty in a way that will remind us not just of Mount Sinai, but of our own potential, of our own capacity as one of God's most beautiful creations, of being a human being, and to let that shine, let that light shine, radiating outward from us as best as we can. We're not going to have the same level as Moses, that's true, but each one of us should look for those moments when we can pull off the mask and show a little extra of that brilliance that is there for us as humans. And from time to time, if we need to put the mask back, that's fine too. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, once again, tomorrow night would be a great time to begin that process for the holiday of Purim. Hoping to see everybody there so that we can rejoice in how tearing off the mask and revealing that true light of Esther, and to see the true wickedness of Haman, is a reminder of what is actually right in the world and what needs to be done to put the world right, almost on a daily basis. If there are no other questions or comments, then we will wrap it up for today. I hope that everybody has a wonderful Purim. Purim Sameach to everyone. It should be a time of rejoicing, a time of joy. Whether you are currently happy or currently facing great difficulties, try to make Purim at least a moment where you can boost that happiness for a moment for yourself and for others by giving to them, by sharing your celebration with them. And then, whatever needs to be done the day after, well, we can do that together. Take care, everyone.